Hey guys, my name is Colson Rosa, and welcome back to Seraphim Stories. So today I want to talk about resolution, and this is the last video on the 3-act structure, at least to form the basic understanding you should have of the 3-act structure, as I may return to this concept in later videos. But I want to first mention that there are some differences in some of the naming conventions of the 3-act structure. Sometimes they'll use different terms than I've used. So I hope that you understand that if you looked at something like Google Images and looked up the 3-act structure of writing, you're going to get a lot of different perspectives, but they're all talking about the same general concept. So sometimes I'll call it the build-up phase, the confrontation phase, and the resolution. And sometimes they'll move the timing of the climax. Sometimes the climax will be in that middle stage of the 3-act structure. Sometimes it'll be in the ending stage of that 3-act structure. And this partially depends on the type of story that you're going to be telling. So of course, when I talked about climax, those same tips and techniques can be used no matter where the climax is at. But in some stories, it will just end suddenly and abruptly on the climax, and the reader is just kind of left with their mouth hanging wide open, just wondering what just happened. In other stories, there will then be a climax somewhere maybe toward the end of the 2nd act or the beginning or middle of this 3rd act. And then there will be a time of reflection or picking up the pieces after this event. And no matter what type of story you're telling, I think a lot of these attributes to the 3-act structure are important to know. So the first thing I want to talk about when it comes to resolution is final actions. The last major events needed for closure to be brought about. Now, of course, the climax is the height of the action, or the height of the emotional tension, or the height of the drama and the character stakes. But then there are some actions that will need to take place at the end to bring retribution, perhaps, to bring judgment, or to maybe just bring closure, like I mentioned, to the characters and the setting. Just because the climax has occurred doesn't mean some other more minor actions that are still important to wrap up the entire storyline don't need to take place. So you should be thinking through what some of those actions are and including them in your plotline. And these last major events will then mean a lot to the characters because they probably feel the climax wasn't fully secured and that victory wasn't fully secured until those last couple of actions take place. The next thing I want to talk about is the finishing of character arcs. Throughout your story, your characters have been battling, struggling, growing, learning, falling short, coming close, learning about each other, developing friendships or hatreds, and a lot has changed with them. Even if their core personality and tendencies stay the same, they've gone through a lot, and this might change their perspective on certain attributes and elements of the world around them, or even of their friends or of themselves. So when you're tying up the character arcs, you need to think about where have the characters grown and failed? What have they learned and what have they lost? And then tie up their character progression to the point where you are satisfied with who the character has become. You're satisfied as an author even if this means the character became a worse person in the end because of some of the tragedies they went through. Now, unless you're telling a very specific kind of story, I would recommend staying away from a character arc where the character is completely worse at the end of it, or maybe the villain is worse at the end of it, but you want characters that the reader can root for and support and say, wow, look at how much they've grown and changed for the better. And even if some characters have changed a little bit less throughout their arc, you want some other characters to have a very strong predominant arc that the reader can then latch onto. You want some characters that are not the same by the end of the story, so that they can then almost notice how one character hasn't changed as much, but they have. They've learned things. They've grown in maybe wisdom or strength or truth or knowledge or hope. A lot of these different emotions and positive characteristics that they've then been granted throughout the course of this adventure. The next thing I want to talk about is removing plot holes. You need to think about what are all of the threads of the story that I started in the build-up or in the climax, and how are they tied up at the end? If you introduced a major problem, has that major problem been solved? If you introduced various characters that were supposed to do various things, have they done all of those things? Looking through even maybe some of the books or the movies you've read or watched, looking at some of the plot holes you've seen in them and saying, I don't want that to happen to my book. I want to try to find confusing areas and clarify them. Try to find things the reader wanted closure on and give them closure on that area. Let them know what is finally happening to the setting. Let them know what is finally happening to each of the characters, or maybe even the characters' families, and tie up any possible loose ends you can. And this is something you'll then dive even deeper into in your editing, looking for plot holes once again. The next thing I want to talk about with the resolution is completing the theme. Wherever the theme began, explain how it was advanced and how the reader should view it. Now, sometimes the theme is a little bit more explicit and sometimes the theme is a little bit more hidden. But either way, you want to gratify your reader who's paid attention to that theme to the final conclusion of that theme at the end of the book. For example, if your theme is greed, perhaps, and there's a large treasure presented toward the end of the book, you could have a character turn away from that treasure, or take that treasure and give it to somebody else in need, or do a lot of different things in that manner to then show greed is not the answer. The love of money cannot get you so far in life. It's like the saying goes, money can't buy happiness. And if that's one of your themes in your book, don't forget to talk about it at the end of the book. And you could even contrast characters that fall short in this area versus characters that rise above in this area and do the right thing. So if your message is more hidden, it should still be shown through the actions of your main characters especially. And if your message is a little bit more explicit, don't beat your reader over the head with it. Don't every chapter just non-stop talk about it over and over, but have it be predominant enough in emotional moments or moments that really mean the most. That's when the theme shines through the brightest. The next thing I then want to talk about is the condition of the setting. We've spent a lot of time in this setting as a reader, especially if the book is longer than 200 pages. You've been invested in this setting for quite a bit of time. And I know, at least for me as a reader, I want to know, at least in a general sense, although some specifics would be nice, of what is the condition we're leaving this setting in. Are we leaving the setting having changed at all? Has it been broken down and torn apart? Has a lot of progress been made with a lot of new buildings built, or a lot of new laws or social structures in place that are just promoting the welfare and life of the characters? And how do the characters maybe even feel about their setting now that the story's over? Or what have they seen change with that setting? It doesn't always have to be for the better, although even if the setting has changed for the worse, maybe you could implement some aspects of hope or some ideas of change that will then promote the setting and bring it back to a better place once a lot of work is done. We might not see that work, but we might just know at the end of the book, work is getting started to repair the damages that have occurred. Now, I then also want to talk about, with resolution, some of the goals that you should have for this third act of your novel. You should want it to be satisfying. Even if it's maybe a little bit more unique of a novel, more of a strange or novel concept, it should be satisfying in the end to see that there's a full completion to the story. Even if you leave a cliffhanger at the end of the book, there should be a satisfaction for what has accomplished and what has taken place. Even if the villains aren't totally defeated, the heroes perhaps have made enough progress against them that you're satisfied that things are in a much better place, a much more interesting place, or perhaps even if it is a much darker place, how is that satisfying? Because you need to be very careful if you're going with that type of story, because usually for the reader, that isn't satisfying to know that things have gotten a lot worse. Now, if it's a multiple book series, you can then rectify that solution. But if you're going with a setting or a problem that's gotten a lot worse, and that's how you're ending the book, satisfy the reader to know that there's still heroes out there, still people willing to fight back that darkness. Another goal should be that all the questions are answered. You know, if you've read a fair number of books, that you're going to have a lot of questions while you're reading that book, and so will your reader, and that's not a bad thing. A reader who's asking questions is a reader who cares about the book and cares about the story, cares about the characters, and that's exactly what you want. But you want to be answering at least the major questions that the reader has so they're not lost and confused. And this should also be a goal scene by scene, that one scene doesn't raise serious questions that are never going to get answered in the book. Another goal could be, depending on your novel, to set up future books, to leave just a taste or just a glimmer of what is to come with the next book, or to perhaps do a cliffhanger that then intrigues the reader on what's coming next. Another thing you can do that's very important is the response to the climax. So when I say the response to the climax, what I mean is how the characters respond to the climax, how the protagonist and antagonist react to what has just occurred. Maybe there's some of those final actions that then tie up their reactions and cement them in stone, make them unmovable, or make changes occur to the characters based on those final actions that have taken place in response to the climax. The climax is such an important moment that we should know how characters feel about it afterward, or how the world or civilization feels about it afterward. It shouldn't just be this huge moment that then everybody falls quiet about afterward. Another goal for the resolution could be to show the future of these characters. You don't have to go into every specific detail, but you can show where they're headed in a general trajectory and where these characters might end up in their life. They might not all end up in a good place. Many of them probably will, though, end up in a much better place that they might have never expected to have been in. But that's really encouraging for the character to get to go on a better journey to a better place, or maybe in new, more favorable conditions. And then, last but not least, you want to give a fond farewell to your reader after so much is accomplished. This goes back to the theme of being satisfying, but you want to almost in a way thank your reader so much for having read your book, tying it up nicely at the end, especially if it's the end of a series, and just having that emotional payoff, that sweet relief that the battle is over, those deep character moments where your characters feel like they've gone through so much and maybe they've changed for the better because of it, or just seeing the lives that are saved, seeing the hope that is restored, seeing the love that has been born, true love that really matters, that fights for the people that they love. So guys, I want to thank you so much for watching this video. The resolution portion of a book can just tie up so deeply all the emotions and all of the adventure that the reader has gone on through the entire story, and that's why I love it so much. So I hope you guys can really apply some of these different themes, some of these different goals and actions and activities to your resolution, learning how to craft it in a much better light and manner. So guys, if you'd consider liking and subscribing to this channel, I'd love to tell you so much more about creative writing, about the books that I've written, and helping you guys with a community that will support you as you start to write your own short story or novel. Or even if you're not a writer, just somebody learning so much more about the books and the movies that you've been enjoying so you can have a much deeper appreciation for them. So tell your friends about this channel if you have somebody who'd be interested in this type of content, and I want to thank you guys so much. I hope you have a great day. God bless.